Okay, I hope you can see my picture here. We're going to be talking about right here. White supremacy manifestation and progressive education seen through the marginalization of employment with PWIs. Okay, I'm setting up my paper and would like to thank ARA and Division F, History and Historiography, for allowing me to present my paper research here entitled White Supremacy Manifestation and Progressive Education Seen Through the Marginalization of Employment with PWIs. I use keywords and terms like PWI, which stand for predominantly white institution, higher educational system, university and colleges mostly across the nation, which is my main topic of my research work here with employment discrimination. White supremacy, which is a long history of discriminatory and racist practices by the belief that the white race is more superior and race and should dominate society while excluding other racial and ethnic groups as less than. For examples, it's large and structural, and don't take it personal. It's not. And it's not small, but large in size with groups, institutions, and organizations. And it's manifested in many different ways, historically through force, overt, segregation, institutionalized, marginalized, and today sophisticated. And my work here, it is still done intentionally, implicitly, explicitly, and unconsciously biased. My thesis look into three parts of my paper, which I examine how white supremacy continued to manifest in higher education within predominantly white institution, PWIs, and employment, with its lack of hiring and promoting Black and brown people in faculty and in civil service leadership position. This paper also look into how leaders can learn from history in higher education, such as administrators, human resource officers, and we as educators and professors in the field of education history, by improving our limited research in this particular area of repeated discriminatory and negative practices even today. However, education historians and other scholars from interdisciplinary perspective have argued, quote, since the beginning of this country in the 17th century to the present, how institutionalized white supremacy have been made more credible to learners by normalizing it to everyday business as usual, decision making, stereotyping, and various bias ideologies because of power and greed of capitalism, unquote. They also argue how sophisticated it can be with companies and organizations intentionality that continue to promote inequalities in employment, especially with PWIs, which I focus on the last 3 decades from the 1990s to the 2020s. Finally, my articles show from a historical progressive educational perspective how dismantling institutionalized white supremacy strategically is more needed through education that's more critical in thinking and social justice advocacy and work that's scientifically based. My theoretical framework, according to many education historians, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, in early 20th century America, he not only studied the promotion of education for the African American race by saying these prophetic words, quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, unquote. Du Bois' prophetic words here were not just limited to obtaining an education, but also through the aftermath of educating Black folks for being employed and promoted fairly. Education historians and other interdisciplinary fields have agreed that white supremacy is so historically infused into Western culture and embedded into a social structure that to speak of society in the United States, European, or post colonial context is practically to speak of it as racism, white privilege, and Eurocentric domination on a global scale. This reminds me of the threat to March on Washington movement in 1941 that never occurred, initiated by civil rights activist A. Philip Randall, which many education historians tend to forget about, but only remember the famous March to Washington in 1963, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. However, prior to the 1963 march, it was A. Philip Randall who scared and put a lot of pressure on the federal government by threatening them with a call to action mass protest by many African Americans across the nation, mostly against segregation within the defense industries and with government jobs, which created a huge unemployment problem with many people of color, especially blacks, who were discriminated against through labor employment. This threat to march on Washington did lead to an executive order 8802 by then President Roosevelt stated that there should be, quote, no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or the government because of race, creed, color, or national origin, unquote. Even after this threat and executive order was implemented, still the famous March to Washington occurred in 1963, led by Dr. King, and it was all about jobs and freedom. First jobs, then freedom, secondly. Remember, it was jobs first. These practices still can be seen continually and currently in America, generally speaking, but more specifically in higher education with PWIs sophisticatedly within employment, also called racialized social structures. In early 20th century America, white supremacy beliefs and ideas allege the natural superiority of lighter skin or white. In today's time, it's more who fit in, make a better fit, or better team players over certain racial groups. Scholars argue, quote, that the creation of a new classification promote and perpetuate white supremacy in decision-making spaces that maintain the concept of whiteness in its sophisticated context of hierarchy and class privilege social economically, unquote. Although our 1964 federally mandated Civil Rights Act supposed to protect many people of color and or marginalized groups who have been disproportionately affected also by not being in decision-making spaces or promoted compared to their white counterpart, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. With my technique and methods as a progressive education historian, my research work here could be considered a little different from the norm, non traditional, unique, and very original. In other words, how this progressive academic work could advocate for the expansion of how we see and practice education historical research work in the areas of inquiry that is rarely used. I think because my work here being so original, I couldn't find too many sources in this respected field of education history that supported my concerns of how white supremacy continued to sophisticatedly manifest with PWI systems with race and employment, as well as the lack of historical literature research and published based on my argument. This literature is either absent or limited in the historiography conversations. However, I continue to explain the few theories and scholars that help make sense of my research work and argument from the field of education history, as well as plenty from an interdisciplinary approach. These sources are qualitative sources, which are critical in thinking and critical race theory. I also included the methodology of life history interviews from Black and Brown ordinary employees I knew and know, which include my own personal experiences as a human subject employee too. These historical and current mixed theories exposes the everyday ordinary talks, dialogue, fear, observation, and practices among organizations, companies, system, particularly within PWIs and their hierarchical structure with groups. Here are more scholarly quotes addressing these PWIs issue. All these are quotes, unquote. Higher education in the United States have been shaped by marketization and privatization, which are fundamentally based on racialized exploitation and destruction. Research and recent protest movement shows that academia is subject to race-based inequality that hampers the recruitment and retention of scholars of color, reducing scientific impact. Findings show that at PWIs, Black and Latino faculty are severely underrepresented at most public 4 years colleges and universities, and how current racial discrimination in employment is less identifiable and harder to recognize, sophisticated in nature, posing problems for social scientific conceptualization and measurement. So more research need to be done in these areas of one, race within employment, two, how well does university and colleges, if any, prepare students for perhaps discriminatory practices when applying for jobs in higher education, and three, how PWIs promote how well diverse they are based on their mission statement, but in actuality, they are far from it, particularly when it comes to hiring and promoting people of color. My evidence and facts. My topic also originated from my personal experiences as an African American male wearing many hats at a PWI, University of Illinois, for 30 years, retiring in 2017, and interviewing my Black and Brown co-workers, faculty affected by the discriminatory practices too. But I haven't included them in my paper yet. These practices within PWIs can be complex, complicated, messy, and once again sophisticated due to the several hierarchical structural layers established within these institutions. Most of the leaders are mostly white males, um, while their workforce make up by and large people of color without any or very little say when decisions are made. These, quote, sophisticated acts are achieved without being obviously noticed through loopholes, biased interpretation, and manipulation among organizational leaders, unquote. In a 2012 University of Illinois study published by Implementing Diversity at Predominantly White University, they looked into the campus housing division, whom I worked whom I worked for then for many years, and concluded that there were a lack of people of color not being hired nor promoted in senior leadership position, which included other UIUC unit across the campus as well. Commentary in the Chronicle of Higher Education 2010 also supported these findings with many PWIs stating, quote, unfortunately, many time managers and other faculty leaders are encouraged during human resource sponsored trainings and workshop to use their social network to get the word out about upcoming job opportunity vacancy even before the job have been officially posted, or they even have prior knowledge and access to this information to share it with their close circles, social peers, and associate circle friends before it is made publicly known, unquote. Also, a former HR recruiter specialist said, quote, research suggests the average time to review a resume material is about 6 seconds because the human brain is bombarded with over 80% of information a day. So our brain creates shortcuts to make quick decisions without it being overwhelmed, which in the end create biased decision, whether we are aware of it or not, that determine whether your resume or CV goes to the yes or no pile, unquote. So we can see how HR on many levels at PWIs make mistakes every day through lazy, intentional, sophisticated, implicit, explicit, and unconsciously biased act. With my findings and outcome, here another here's another list of scholarly work suggesting how to dismantle institutionalized white supremacy with PWIs. All quotes unquote. To be very strategic and consistent daily for drastic changes and for the long haul. Employment Oversight Committee, they are not reliable. They are part of the institutionalized system, which in the end favored PWI white supremacy practices. Strategically file lawsuits, like in the case with ASU 2014 case, a black professor denied deanship because of his color, and he won the case, receiving a large settlement. Learn to unpack these learn to uncompact these complex, messy, and complicated situations. This is what real education scholarship is. Faculty leaders ensure mission goal implement their policies that help and not hamper faculty diversity initiatives. University educators join local civil rights grassroots organizations to fight against any inequality in nature. Faculty and professors must do more than just lecture, research, publish, and service, but use their advanced knowledge uh, that's scientific related to speak up and out against any form of marginalization. This is true education. Revisionists, activists, critical thinkers, social justice change agent, always pushing back for a better union and democracy. In my conclusion, in dismantling institutionalized white supremacy with PWI's employment can be eradicated one way, quote, through early education, critical thinking pedagogy at pre-K and or kindergarten level in the public school system, unquote. That's my quote, Dr. Charles Young. Sociologist, historian, and scholar Dr. Michael Eric Dyson said, quote, if higher educational system don't become too political like our deceptive governments are, then they could be the real answer, problem solver, and change agent to this traditional long systemic issue through their great academic research work, potential to change the world, unquote. And lastly, I would like to end with these proactive questions for educational researcher like us that I'm still grappling with. One, what are we doing to ensure that we are diversifying our faculty and staff and retaining and supporting them? Two, how will institution remove practices, behavior, and barriers in general to achieve diversity? And three, how can we address how institutions will address the organizational structure and practices that will support and retain diversity for faculty and staff. Thank you. That's it. Which is the title of my research work here, once again, is White Supremacy Manifestation and Progressive Education Seen Through the Marginalization of Employment with PWIs.